The smell came first. Ozone and scorched copper, the specific stink of superheated coolant boiling off a cracked line, thick enough to coat the back of the throat. Then the sound, a low structural groan, metal remembering it wasn't built to bend this way. Then heat, radiating through 3 bulkheads like a held breath about to be let out. Deck 9 of the Vashtar warship Ashen Cradle was dying by inches, and everyone on it knew it. Emergency bulkheads had already dropped along half the corridor, sealing off sections that had gone too hot to enter, and the one still open glowed faintly orange at the seams, like doors into an oven nobody had thought to check before lighting. Sparks rained down from a severed conduit overhead in lazy, hissing arcs. Somewhere below decks, a structural support groaned under heat stress it was never designed to survive, a sound that traveled up through boots and into teeth. The ship's automated damage control voice cycled through the same clipped warning on a loop, hull integrity failing. All personnel evacuate, as though repetition alone might make the fire listen. Klaxons pulsed amber through the smoke. A woman's voice, distorted by a cracked vocoder, screamed into the general channel in the clipped formal cadence of her people. The containment field has failed. No one survives plasma fire. Abandon the deck. This is not a request. Bodies moved the other way, away from the fire, away from the screaming, away from the woman who had said those words and was now trapped behind them. Nobody noticed the human in the maintenance corridor 40 meters aft, kneeling over an open coolant panel with a headlamp clipped crook to a scavenge strap, until he stood up. 3 decks below, damage control teams were losing the larger fight. A dozen Vashtar firefighters in heat-resistant armor had been pushing back the edges of the blaze for 6 minutes with foam cannons and coordinated discipline, and it hadn't been enough. The plasma line's rupture point sat behind a support strut none of them could safely reach, and every attempt to approach it had driven them back with second-degree burns even through armor built to withstand far worse than a human ever could. Their team lead had already radioed the bridge with the assessment nobody wanted to hear. The source of the breach was unreachable by conventional means, and the deck would need to be sealed and the fire allowed to burn itself out, along with anyone still trapped inside it. That assessment was still traveling up the chain of command, unacknowledged, when Milo Reyes stood up from an open coolant panel 40 meters away and started walking. The man nobody bothered to watch. His name was Milo Reyes, and if you'd asked anyone on the Ashen Cradle to describe him, most wouldn't have been able to. He was the kind of person starships absorbed without noticing, coveralls the color of old rust, sleeves rolled to the elbow, forearms marked with the pale ropey scars that came from grabbing the wrong pipe too many times. He kept a magnetic wrist roll of tools that never left his side, and half his teeth had a faint gray cast from breathing recycled ship air for 6 years straight. He was 34 and looked 41, and the only thing remarkable about him was how thoroughly unremarkable everyone agreed he was. Back on Earth, before any of this, he'd been a shipyard mechanic in a coastal city that didn't exist on any star chart the Vashtar had ever bothered to map, working 12-hour shifts on cargo haulers for a wage that barely covered rent. When the first alien contact teams arrived, humanity had exactly one thing to offer a civilization 11,000 years further along than it was: cheap, willing hands. Milo had signed the labor contract without reading half of it, because the alternative was 6 more years of the same shipyard, the same 12-hour shifts, the same ceiling. He hadn't expected glory. He'd expected a paycheck and maybe, if he was lucky, a view of some other star's sunset. He wasn't even supposed to be aboard a warship. He'd been civilian contract crew on a Vashtar salvage vessel 8 months back, patching reactor housings for alien engineers who considered the work beneath them, when the Ashen Cradle got reassigned to a war footing and needed every warm body who could hold a torch. Milo had been attached, a polite word for conscripted, because humans were cheap, expendable, and, according to the ship's requisition memo, adequately dexterous for menial technical labor. He'd read that memo. He'd laughed at it, actually, alone in his bunk, because it was funnier than it was insulting. Humans had been flying starships for exactly 19 years by the time the Vashtar Compact found them, and in the eyes of a species that had been slicing through the void for 11,000, 19 years counted as still being wet behind the ears. Milo didn't argue with that, he just fixed things. Coolant regulators, Atmos. Eric scrubbers, the temperamental gravity plating on Deck 6 that nobody else could get to stop groaning at 300 hours. He was good at it in the quiet, unglamorous way that never got written into anyone's commendation file. The Vashtar officers who passed him in the corridor didn't nod. They didn't need to. He was furniture that occasionally fixed itself. Which was exactly why, when the fire alarm cut through Deck 9, and every Vashtar crewman with 2 legs and a survival instinct sprinted the other way, nobody thought to stop the small, soft, fragile creature walking calmly toward it with a fire-rated tarp yanked off a supply rack and wrapped twice around his forearm. No way out that didn't cost something. Milo had heard the deck ceiling order the same as everyone else, relayed flat and final over the general channel by a voice trying not to sound like it was giving up. Deck 9 is to be sealed at the forward and aft bulkheads. All personnel clear the area immediately. He'd also heard, a moment later, the quieter addendum that wasn't meant for general broadcast but leaked through anyway on an open channel somebody had forgotten to close. That Officer Vashkoran's beacon was still transmitting from inside the section about to be sealed, and that there was, per standard doctrine, nothing further that could be done about it. He could have kept walking the other way. Nobody would have blamed him, nobody would have even noticed, the way nobody ever noticed him, which was itself a strange kind of freedom. Every rule on this ship, every briefing memo about human dexterity and human fragility, gave him a perfectly good excuse to let the deck seal and the fire finish what it started. He was contract labor. He wasn't security, wasn't damage control, wasn't anyone whose job description included walking into a plasma breach for an officer who, 3 days earlier, hadn't known his name. He thought about it for exactly as long as it took to grab the fire tarp off the supply rack, which is to say, not very long at all. The alien who was supposed to die quietly. Her name, what humans could pronounce of it, was Sira Vashkoran, 3rd-rank tactical officer, and she had spent the last 4 minutes doing the 2 things her training told her to do when a plasma coolant line ruptured mid-battle. Seal the breach, and if that failed, die with her boots on rather than let the fire spread to the reactor trunk 2 decks below, where 600 crew were still fighting a boarding action. She was, by any human measure, enormous, nearly 7 feet at the shoulder, her frame dense with corded gray-blue muscle under armor plating scorched black on one side. Her people didn't build soft. Vashtar biology ran hot and heavy, built for high-gravity worlds, built to shrug off impacts that would pulp a human ribcage. She had killed things bigger than her before. She had never, in 11 years of service, expected to die pinned under a support strut with her left leg crushed, and a plasma conduit hissing open 6 feet from her face, venting a jet of white-blue fire that ate through bulkhead alloy like it was paper. She had already sent the order to seal the deck. She had already accepted, with the flat, disciplined calm her people prided themselves on, that this was where her service ended. So when the access hatch at the far end of the corridor cycled open and something small stepped through the smoke, she assumed it was a malfunction. A drone, maybe. Nothing alive would walk toward this. "Deck is sealed," she called out, voice raw from smoke. "Get back. The line will breach fully in under 90 seconds. No one survives plasma fire." The shape kept coming. Through the haze she made out coveralls, a crooked headlamp, a tarp wound around one arm like a boxer's wrap. A human. "You are the maintenance contractor," Sira said, recognition flickering through the pain in her voice, though it did nothing to soften her assessment. "You should not be here. Your kind was not built to withstand this environment. Even your commanding officers describe your species as fragile. Prey-species biology, one report called it. Return to the evacuation route before the deck seals. I heard you the first time, Milo said, and dropped to one knee beside the strut pinning her leg, already running his hands along the metal, feeling for the stress point the way he'd feel for a fever on a sick child's forehead. You said no one survives it. Didn't say nobody gets to try. This is not a rescue you are equipped for, Sierra said, and there was no fear in her voice, only the clipped, formal precision of someone reciting a fact. Your species lacks the tolerance. The radiant heat alone will cook you from 10 feet. Yeah, I noticed it's warm. He was already unspooling a length of cable from his wrist roll, wedging one end under the strut. You gonna keep telling me statistics, or you gonna help me lift when I say lift? Something in her flat gray eyes shifted. Not hope, she didn't allow herself that yet, but a kind of clinical astonishment, the way you'd look at an instrument reading that shouldn't be possible. What Sierra Vashtar knew about humans. Sierra had served 11 years in the compact fleet, and in that time she had built, without ever meaning to, a mental catalog of every species she'd fought beside or against. The Threxy communicated in pressure waves and could not lie without their skin flushing violet. The Ombri bred for cold and could not survive above freezing without armor. And humans she had cataloged, months ago, in a single dismissive line in her own private logs. Soft-shelled, short-lived, prone to overheating in low-effort tasks, valuable chiefly for their willingness to perform labor no one else wanted. She had watched them in the corridors of the Ashen Cradle the way she watched most support staff, peripherally, without real attention. They sweated when they worked, which her own biology found faintly alarming the first time she'd seen it, as if the small creatures were perpetually on the verge of some catastrophic fluid failure. They tired quickly by Vashtar standards. They complained, in the low mutter she'd learned to tune out, about hours and pay and the temperature of the recycled air. None of that had prepared her for the sound of boots stopping in front of a fire everyone else was running from. Her own commanding officer, months earlier, had put it more bluntly than she ever would have. Frail, he'd called them, in a briefing she'd sat through half listening. Fragile. Adequate for menial work, nothing more. Do not expect resilience from a species that has not yet learned to build a warship without our schematics. She had nodded along, because it matched everything she'd observed, and because contempt asked for by a commanding officer was easier to hold than to question. It was strange, then almost disorienting, to lie pinned under 400 pounds of buckled support strut with a plasma line venting 6 feet from her skull, and hear that same frail, fragile species walk toward her at a steady, unhurried pace, wrapping a fire tarp around one bare forearm like a man preparing to do a job he'd done 100 times before, even though this was, by every metric that mattered, nothing like anything he'd done before. 90 seconds, give or take. The plasma line wasn't a fire in the human sense. It was closer to a blowtorch fed by an engine the size of a house, and the containment collar that should have choked it off had been sheared clean through by shrapnel from the boarding assault. Milo had seen the schematic for this exact conduit system 4 days earlier, bored out of his mind on a night shift, tracing pipe runs on a tablet because there was nothing else to do and he liked knowing where things went. He hadn't known then it would matter. It mattered now. There's a secondary shutoff 2 junctions back, he said, mostly to himself, working the cable taut. Manual valve, if it hasn't slagged. It has not, Sierra said. I attempted it. My hands would not close around it before the heat forced retreat. Your hands are the size of dinner plates and you were bleeding out of your leg at the time. Different situation. He threw his weight backward against the cable, and the strut groaned, shifted a half-inch, no more, not enough. Sweat had already soaked through the back of his coveralls, human sweat, useless-looking, beating and running in ways Vashtar skin simply didn't do because Vashtar bodies didn't need to shed heat that way. Their world hadn't demanded it. His had. You cannot move that alone, Sierra said. The mass exceeds. I'm not moving it alone. Push with your good leg on 3. He planted his boots. One less thing you're an expert on today, apparently. She stared at him a half-second longer than the moment allowed for. And then, because there was nothing else to do, and because some old animal part of her recognized competence when it heard it, regardless of the body it came in, she braced her good leg against the deck plating and pushed. The strut groaned again, shifted 2 inches, then 4, and Sierra dragged her ruined leg free with a sound she didn't let herself make out loud. The relief lasted exactly as long as it took the plasma jet to widen. The first caused. The conduit chose that moment to fully rupture, the last threads of metal giving way, and a secondary jet of superheated gas lanced across the corridor at knee height. Milo didn't have time to calculate an escape vector. He grabbed Sierra under the arms, an absurd image, a 170-pound human hauling at a 400-pound alien officer twice his height, and hauled her sideways into the lee of a support pillar as the jet passed through the space where they'd been standing. It still caught him. The edge of the plasma wash licked across his exposed forearm, the one not wrapped in the tarp, and the pain was immediate and total, a line drawn straight into the nerve. He didn't scream. He made a short, clipped sound through his teeth and kept moving because stopping was worse than the burn. "Your arm," Sierra said, staring at the blistering skin, at the way his sleeve had simply ceased to exist across 4 inches of forearm. "Later," Milo said, voice tight. "Which way's the junction?" She told him. 20 meters back, past a bulkhead that was going to be glowing orange by the time they reached it. The second caused. They didn't run so much as stagger drag. Sierra's weight braced against Milo's shoulder, her crushed leg dragging uselessly, blood dark, near black in the emergency lighting smearing a trail behind them. Milo's lungs had started to burn independent of the plasma. The smoke down here was thick with vaporized coolant, a chemical stew that would strip a human's airway raw in under 2 minutes of exposure. He'd read that specification too, once out of boredom. He was regretting how thorough his boredom had been. "You are wheezing," Sierra observed, matter of fact even now. "Coolant smoke. Doesn't love human lungs." He didn't add that his vision had started to swim at the edges, dark and sparking. Didn't add that his hands, when he reached the manual shutoff valve, a wheel the size of a trash can lid fused half shut with heat-warped metal, were shaking badly enough that the first 2 attempts to grip it slid off entirely. "You cannot turn that," Sierra said. "I could not, and my grip strength exceeds. Everybody keeps telling me what I can't do today." He wrapped both hands in the scorched remains of the tarp, planted a boot against the bulkhead for leverage, and threw his entire body weight sideways into the wheel. It didn't move. He tried again. Behind them, down the corridor, the plasma jet's roar had climbed in pitch, the sound he knew from 4 days of board schematic reading, of pressure building toward a full conduit failure that would vent the fire the length of the entire deck. Third attempt. Something in his shoulder made a sound he didn't like, a wet pop of a joint riding past where it should. Pain lanced down his arm to match the burn already screaming there. The wheel groaned, actually moved this time, a half-inch of grinding, rust-locked motion, and he heard Sierra, beside him despite her ruined leg, adding her own weight to the far side of the wheel, 4-fingered hands wrapped white-knuckled around the rim. "On my mark," she said, and for the first time her voice had lost its flat formality. "Now." They turned it together. The valve gave with a shriek of tortured metal, and the roar down the corridor cut, stuttered, dropped to a hiss, then silence. A door that wouldn't open the right way. Silence at the valve lasted less than a minute before a new problem announced itself. The blast door separating the maintenance corridor from the rest of Deck 9 had buckled in its frame during the initial rupture, and its emergency release, the only way through to a corridor with breathable air, refused to answer either of their attempts to trigger it manually. "Frames warped," Milo said, running his working hand along the seam, feeling for where the metal had bowed. "Motor's probably fine. It just can't pull a door that's not sitting square in its track anymore. Then we require another route, Sierra said, already scanning the corridor behind them, where the air was growing thinner and hotter by the minute. Or we make this door square again. Milo eyed the environmental control panel bolted beside the frame, a unit that on paper existed to regulate the corridor's atmospheric pressure, not to move half a ton of warped alloy. But pressure was pressure, and metal under a big enough pressure differential would move whether it wanted to or not. This section still got an intact bulkhead behind us, right? If I vent atmosphere from behind the door into vacuum on the other side of that ruptured hull section, just for a second, the pressure drop ought to suck the door back toward true, not release it. Just straighten the frame enough that the release motor can finally do its job. That is not what the environmental system is designed to do. Lots of things aren't designed to do what I'm about to do to them, Milo said, already keying in an override sequence with fingers that fumbled twice before finding the right combination. It's kind of become my whole day. The gambit worked, but not gently. The pressure differential slammed through the corridor in a single violent gasp of air, hard enough to rock them both back a step and pop something painful in Milo's already abused ear, and the door groaned, shrieked, and finally shuddered back into alignment enough for the release motor to grab hold and haul it open. Beyond it, breathable air, cooler by a full 20 degrees, and for the first time in what felt like an hour but had been closer to 12 minutes, a path forward that didn't require walking through fire. The weight she couldn't carry alone. They did not get to rest as long as either of them wanted. The valve had bought them silence, not safety. The corridor behind them was still radiating heat like an oven with the door left open, and Sierra's leg, now that the adrenaline of the last 3 minutes was draining out of her, had begun to inform her in increasingly specific detail exactly how broken it was. "I cannot stand," she admitted, which cost her something to say. Vashtar officers did not, as a rule, announce their own limitations. The fracture has shifted. Milo looked at her, 400 pounds of alien warrior, 7 feet of dense muscle and armor, folded against a bulkhead with a leg bent wrong, and did the math the way he did every other problem, not by asking whether it was possible, but by figuring out how. "Okay," he said, "new plan, you're not standing, you're being moved." "You cannot lift me." "Didn't say I was gonna lift you, said you were gonna be moved." He was already stripping a length of insulated cable conduit off the wall, the kind meant for running power lines through tight spaces, testing its give between his hands. Ever seen a sled? She had not, in fact, ever seen a sled, and said so with the flat honesty of someone who genuinely didn't know what he meant. Milo didn't bother explaining. He looped the conduit into a makeshift harness, anchored it around the base of a fixed equipment rack, and half-dragged, half-guided her onto a salvaged deck panel he'd wrenched free with his one working arm, using it as a crude drag sled, the kind of improvisation that would never have occurred to a species that had never needed to move an injured hunting partner 3 miles home without help. Halfway through the drag, Milo's boot caught on a warped deck seam, and he went down hard on one knee, the makeshift harness yanking taut across his chest with enough force to feel something give between 2 ribs, a sharp, grinding pop, followed by a pain that stole the breath clean out of him for a full 3 seconds. He didn't cry out. He'd learned, somewhere in the last 20 minutes, that crying out cost air he didn't have to spare, and instead just knelt there, one hand pressed flat against his side, breathing in shallow, careful sips until the worst of it passed enough to let him stand again. "You are injured further," Sierra said, watching him from the makeshift sled, unable to do anything about it from where she lay. "Rib, probably," Milo managed, hauling himself upright by the harness strap. "Cracked, not broken if I'm lucky. Either way, walking still faster than dying so." He got his shoulders back under the load and started forward again, each breath now a careful negotiation with his own chest. It was slow. It was humiliating for both of them in different ways for her, because it meant surrendering the last of her mobility to a creature a third her size. For him, because his lungs were shredded and his shoulder wasn't fully seated, and every meter of rope hauling sent fresh lightning down his burned arm. But it worked, the way persistence tends to work when raw strength has already failed. Not gracefully, not quickly, just relentlessly, one dragging meter at a time, until they'd cleared the worst of the heat radiating off the ruptured section and reached air a Vashtar's lungs, at least, could tolerate without further damage. "You are exhausted," Sierra said, watching him brace both hands on his knees, chest heaving, sweat running freely down a face gone pale under the soot. "I run hot," Milo managed between breaths. "It's a whole thing, species-wide. We sweat instead of overheating and dying, which, funny enough, is usually a design feature, not a flaw." He straightened, wiped his face with a forearm that immediately regretted the contact, and grinned through the pain in a way that had nothing to do with humor and everything to do with refusing to stop moving. "Ask me again in an hour. I might actually mean it when I say I'm fine." The turning point, nobody spoke aloud. They sat there a moment in the settling quiet, both of them breathing wrong, Sierra in the slow, controlled draws of someone managing pain by discipline, Milo in the ragged, whistling gasps of someone whose lungs had taken more smoke than they were built for. His forearm had gone past pain into a strange cold numbness that he recognized, distantly, as a bad sign. Degree burns didn't hurt. That was the part they didn't tell you. Sierra looked at the arm, then at him, small, soft-skinned, sweating in a way her own biology found faintly grotesque, shaking with exhaustion and shock and blood loss from a wound he hadn't even mentioned on his side. And then she did something that would be repeated later, by crewmen who hadn't even been present as though they had. She reached up with one massive hand, closed it gently, deliberately gently, the care of someone consciously throttling strength that could have crushed his shoulder too. Paced around his good arm and bowed her head. Not far, just enough. Among the Vashtar, the gesture meant one thing, and it wasn't offered lightly. "I owe you my life, and I will not forget the debt." "You are not what the briefing said," she said quietly. "Yeah, well." Milo tried to grin and mostly managed a grimace. "Briefings don't know a good pipe wrench when they see one." The fire wasn't the only thing burning. Word of a rescue on Deck 9 reached the bridge in under 3 minutes, which under normal circumstances would have been the end of the story. An officer saved. A fire contained. A footnote in the after-action report. But the Ashen Cradle didn't have 3 minutes to spare on footnotes, because the boarding action that had ruptured the coolant line in the first place hadn't been random. Commander Threl Castavan, the ship's senior tactical officer, and a Vashtar of the old, uncompromising school, 9 feet of scar tissue and iron opinion, who had personally signed off on classifying humans as adequately dexterous for menial technical labor, stood over the tactical display as the enemy fleet's true formation resolved out of sensor ghosting, and understood, with the cold drop of a man realizing he'd been played, exactly what the boarding party had actually been for. It hadn't been an attack. It had been a delay. Something to keep the Ashen Cradle's shields down and its damage control teams scattered while a second force, 6 ships, not the 2 the sensors had first flagged, running dark on a stealth vector, closed to firing range on the ship's unshielded flank. Castavan recognized the formation before his tactical officer finished reading off the transponder codes, and recognizing it settled a cold weight in his chest that had nothing to do with the odds. This was not a border skirmish. The ships closing on his flank belonged to the Korathi remnant, a splinter faction that had broken from the compact 2 years earlier over a dispute about resource claims along the frontier, and their presence this deep in compact territory, coordinated with a boarding action timed to the minute, meant one thing. Someone inside the chain of command had told them exactly where and when to find the Ashen Cradle alone and vulnerable. This was not bad luck. This was a setup, months in the planning, and the ship sailing into the middle of it hadn't been warned because Whoever had arranged it needed the element of surprise to hold. "They knew our patrol route before we did," Castavan said quietly, more to himself than to the bridge. "That is not something 6 raiders manage on their own." "They wanted us bleeding and blind," Castavan said to no one in particular, "and Deck 9's fire has knocked half our coolant redundancy offline besides." He turned to his second. "Time to weapons range." 4 minutes, Commander. Our shield generators cannot reroute enough coolant to reach full capacity before then. We will take their opening volley with partial shielding at best." On the bridge, the tactical display painted the coming minutes in blunt geometric terms. 6 red contact icons converging on a single blue one, an intercept cone tightening like a drawstring. Castavan had commanded the Ashen Cradle for 6 years, had walked crew through worse odds than this and come out the other side, but he had never done it with a hull already bleeding heat from an uncontained fire and a coolant network cut in half. His second officer, a younger Vashtar named Priel who had not yet learned to keep her voice as flat as regulation demanded, read off the numbers with a tightness that betrayed exactly how bad she thought they were. "At current shield capacity, Commander, we project critical hull breach within 90 seconds of their opening volley. We do not have 90 seconds of margin to spare on anything but weapons." "Understood." Castavan did not raise his voice. Vashtar command doctrine held that a commander's comm was itself a kind of ammunition, the last resource that couldn't be shot out from under him, and he spent it now the way he'd spent it in a dozen engagements before this one, evenly, deliberately, giving his crew nothing to panic against. But privately, watching the geometry tighten on the display, he ran the same arithmetic his second had, and arrived at the same number. Partial shielding against 6 ships was not survivable arithmetic. Castavan had run enough engagements to know exactly how this ended if nothing changed, and there was nothing in the standard playbook that changed it. Every trained engineer who understood the coolant architecture well enough to improvise a fix was either dead, wounded, or 3 decks away fighting the fire that had started this whole mess. Every trained engineer except one who wasn't, technically, trained at all, and who was, at that exact moment, sitting against a scorched bulkhead on Deck 9 with a dislocated shoulder, and a forearm burned down to the second layer of skin, Lee's. Tending to Sierra relay the tactical situation over a borrowed comm unit, because his own hands were shaking too hard to hold one. Elsewhere on the Ashen Cradle, the wounded were still being counted. Deck 9's fire had claimed 2 engineers outright and put 6 more in medical stasis, and the boarding action that had triggered it all had left scorch marks and body bags in 3 separate corridors before Vashtar Marines finally cleared the last of the intruders. It was, by the standards of the Compact's long, grinding border war, an unremarkable engagement, the kind that got logged, mourned briefly, and filed away. What made it different, what would make crew members retell it for years, was the 11 minutes that followed, when the entire ship's survival came down to a maintenance tech nobody had bothered to learn the name of. "Say that again," Milo rasped, "the part about the coolant." Sierra repeated it. 6 ships, 4 minutes, shields at partial capacity because the coolant network that fed them ran through the same trunk lines Milo had just spent the last 10 minutes bleeding over. He closed his eyes for 1 second, and did the thing he was actually, genuinely good at, the thing nobody on this ship had ever bothered to ask him about. He pictured the pipe runs. Every junction, every valve, every redundant loop he traced out of boredom on a night shift because there was nothing else to do and he liked knowing where things went. "Tell your commander," he said, "that I can get him 15% more coolant flow to the shield generators in under 3 minutes, but he's not gonna like how." Priel's voice crackled back through the comm, skeptical in the particular way of someone who had spent her whole career trusting instruments over intuition. "The maintenance technician proposes rerouting a compromised coolant loop through manual override during active combat. This is not a sanctioned procedure. The failure modes are numerous, I know," Milo cut in, surprising himself with how steady his voice came out given how little air he had to spare for talking. "I've read the same manual you have. Probably more of it, honestly, since I've had nothing else to do most nights. The manual's written for a ship that isn't currently on fire. I'm proposing something for the ship we've actually got." There was a pause on the other end, filled with the particular silence of a bridge crew deciding, in real time, whether to trust a species they'd spent months not trusting at all. It was Castovan himself who finally answered, his voice carrying the flat authority of a man who had run out of better options and knew it. "Do it," he said. "Whatever your plan is. You have 3 minutes before their volley reaches us and not 1 second longer." The bigger fire. What Milo proposed, relayed up the chain by an increasingly incredulous Sierra, was this. The plasma conduit he just shut down wasn't only a liability. It was also, by design, cross-connected to the ship's secondary coolant loop, a redundancy system installed for exactly this kind of catastrophic failure, except the automatic failover logic that should have rerouted flow around the damage had been fried along with half the deck's control relays. Automatic failover was down, manual override wasn't. "If I can get to the relay junction 2 decks up," Milo said, working his dislocated shoulder back into its socket against a support strut with a grunt that turned the edges of his vision white, "I can force the reroute by hand. Redirect flow from the dead loop into the shield generator feed. It won't be pretty, and it won't be permanent, but it'll buy your commander his 15%. "You cannot walk 2 decks in your condition," Sierra said. "You cannot walk at all in yours," Milo shot back. "We're even, point me to the junction." She did more than point. Despite a leg that medical scans would later confirm had 3 separate fractures, Sierra hauled herself upright using the same support strut that had nearly killed her, refused the stretcher that arrived moments later, and half-carried, half-guided Milo up 2 decks through smoke-choked maintenance shafts, because she was, by that point, the only person aboard who knew exactly where he needed to go and precisely how little time they had to get there. It was, by any measure, an absurd sight. A wounded 7-foot alien warrior bearing the weight of a burned, dislocated, smoke-poisoned human mechanic through a dying ship's guts, both of them moving on nothing but stubbornness, and a det neither had spoken aloud yet. 2 decks of nothing but stubbornness. The maintenance shaft connecting Deck 9 to the relay junction, 2 levels up, had not been designed for anyone in Sierra's condition, and it had certainly not been designed for anyone carrying Sierra's condition on their back, while their own arm sat useless in a medical seal. The latter rungs were spaced for Vashtar stride, too far apart for Milo to climb one-handed without help, and too narrow-set for Sierra to descend at all, without putting weight on a leg that screamed every time she tried. They solved it the way they'd solved everything else in the last 20 minutes, badly, slowly, and together. Milo went first up each ladder section, bracing himself against the shaft walls, and Sierra, refusing, even now, to be carried like dead weight, hauled herself up rung by rung using her arms alone, teeth gritted, her injured leg trailing uselessly behind her like something that belonged to someone else. Twice she slipped. Twice Milo caught her by the wrist with his one good hand, his shoulder screaming in its half-healed socket, and held until she found her grip again, neither of them saying a word about how close either fall had come to ending things. By the time they reached the access hatch to the relay deck, Milo's vision had narrowed to a gray tunnel at the edges, the particular kind of exhaustion that came from smoke-scarred lungs trying to run a marathon on half their normal air intake. He didn't stop. Stopping, he decided somewhere around the second ladder rung, was a decision he simply wasn't going to make today, regardless of what his body thought about it. "You should rest," Sierra said, watching him sway slightly as he hauled the hatch open, even briefly. "Ship doesn't get a break," Milo said. "Neither do I. Come on, we're close." The relay junction. The junction, when they reached it, was a nightmare of fused conduit and scorched control panels, half its status lights dead, the manual override lever seized in a housing warped by heat. Milo's right arm, the burned one, was useless, wrapped now in a medical seal Sierra had applied with hands too large for the delicate work and too gentle, somehow, to make it worse. He worked left-handed, slowly, every motion costing him more than it should have, sweat running into his eyes, his breath a thin, whistling thing that worried Sierra more than she let show on her face. 2 minutes, she reported, reading a status feed over his shoulder. "I heard you the first time," he said, echoing her own words back at her without quite meaning to, and pried the access panel free with a screwdriver held between 2 fingers because his thumb wouldn't grip anymore. The override lever was seized solid. He tried the tarp-wrapped grip trick again, hands wound in scorched fabric, boot braced against the housing, and it held for exactly as long as it took to realize brute force wasn't going to move 11,000 years of alien engineering built to resist exactly this kind of tampering. 90 seconds, Sierra said, and for the first time there was something under the flatness of her voice that might, in a human, have been called fear. Milo stared at the seized lever, breathing hard, and thought about thermodynamics instead of panicking, because panicking had never fixed a single pipe in his life. Heat expands metal, cold contracts it. "Fire suppression canister," he said. "The one on your belt, give it here." Sierra didn't ask why. She'd stopped asking why 3 decks ago. She unclipped the cryofoam suppressant canister from her armor and pressed it into his working hand, and Milo cracked the seal and sprayed a thin, precise line of sub-zero foam directly along the seized joint of the override lever, watching the metal contract, hearing the faint tick and groan of alloy shrinking away from itself by fractions of a millimeter that were, right now, the only margin he had. 60 seconds. He threw his weight against the lever one more time, left arm screaming, shoulder barely back in its socket, and this time it moved, cracked free with a shudder that ran up through his bones, and the status panel beside him flooded with green as the coolant loop rerouted, flow surging toward the shield generators 2 decks up. "Reroute confirmed," Sierra said, staring at the readout like she didn't quite believe it. "Shield capacity climbing, 11%, 13, 15. The ship shuddered around them as the enemy's opening volley struck home, 6 near-simultaneous impacts that rippled down the hull like a fist dragged along a drum, throwing loose equipment across the bridge and dropping every unsecured crewman to a knee. Lights flickered, died, came back dimmer. Somewhere aft, a structural groan rolled through the deck plating, the ship's whole frame protesting the abuse. For one long, breathless second, every officer on the bridge waited for the follow-through, the secondary shudder that would mean the shields had failed after all, that the 15% hadn't been enough. It didn't come. The shield display flickered, dipped into red for a heartbeat, and steadied. "Shields holding," Priel reported, and her voice cracked slightly on the second word, the first real break in her composure all day. "Integrity at 41% and stable. We took that volley, Commander. We're still here." Castavan allowed himself exactly one exhale before straightening. "Back to full attention. Then we make certain we stay here, ready the return volley." 2 decks below, in a relay junction that still smelled of scorched insulation, Sierra and Milo felt the same impact as a dull shudder through the deck plating beneath their boots, and held. The turning point made visible. The bridge crew felt it, the difference between a shield that failed and a shield that groaned but stood. Commander Castavan felt it in the way his own boots stayed planted instead of throwing him against a console. And when the after-action logs later confirmed exactly what had bought them those 15 percentage points, and exactly who had bought it, and at what physical cost, the reaction among a crew that had spent months calling humans adequately dexterous for menial technical labor was not immediate. It came later, when Castavan himself walked down to the ship's medical bay 9 feet of scarred, uncompromising Vashtar commander, ducking through a doorway built for smaller frames, and found Milo Reyes lying on a gurney with his arm in a regeneration wrap, half-conscious, muttering something about overtime pay to a medic who had no idea what the phrase meant. Castavan did not make a speech. His people didn't. He looked at the burned arm, at the dislocated shoulder already mending in a brace, at the small, unremarkable human who had walked toward a fire everyone else had run from, and he did the thing that meant more, among the Vashtar, than any number of words could. He unclipped the ceremonial sidearm from his own belt, the one every Vashtar officer carried but almost never surrendered, a mark of rank and honor going back generations, and set it, without a word, on the tray beside Milo's gurung. Among the Vashtar, a commander's sidearm was not a weapon in the way a rifle was a weapon. It was issued once, at the end of officer training, engraved with a service number that never changed hands in the entire history of the compact fleet except under two circumstances: court-martial, or a debt of life so total that surrendering the sidearm was the only gesture left that meant anything. Castavan had carried his for 31 years. He had never surrendered it to anyone, not once, not even to the commanding officers who had outranked him for most of his career. The medic froze. Sierra, standing in the doorway on a leg still knitting itself back together, went very still. "Commander," she said carefully, "he is unconscious. He will not know what you have done." "He will be told," Castavan said. "When he wakes, that is enough." And then, because even a commander of the old, uncompromising school could not entirely resist the pull of the moment, he added, quieter, adequately dexterous, "I wrote those words myself." He looked at the burned arm one more time. "I was wrong about a great many things, it seems." The second fire. The reprieve did not last. 6 ships against 1, even one holding shields at partial capacity, was a fight the Ashen Cradle was still, mathematically, going to lose, and the enemy commander on the other side of that engagement had not spent the last hour running a delay tactic just to be stopped by 15% more coolant flow. 3 hours later, with the ship limping under continuous fire and half its weapons batteries offline, the second complication arrived in the form of a transmission the bridge crew almost dismissed as jamming noise, until the encryption resolved and revealed itself as internal. A signal originating from inside the Ashen Cradle's own network, feeding the enemy fleet a live tactical picture of every shield weak point the ship had left. There was a traitor aboard, not a spy in the dramatic sense, just a junior logistics officer named Varen Das who had, months earlier, sold targeting data to a rival faction within the Vashtar Compact for reasons that would later prove to be almost embarrassingly mundane. Debt, ambition, the promise of a promotion under a new command structure that never materialized. Whatever his reasons, the effect was the same. The enemy fleet knew, in real time, exactly where the Ashen Cradle's shields were thinnest, and they were walking their fire straight into it. Castavan felt the shift before his instruments confirmed it, the uncanny sense, honed over 3 decades of ship-to-ship combat, that an enemy was no longer guessing. Their volleys stopped spreading across the shield envelope and started landing, one after another, on the exact same weakened quadrant, the one that had never fully recovered from the coolant crisis 3 hours earlier. No sensor sweep, however good, produced targeting that precise by accident. "They are reading us," he said, more to himself than to the bridge crew. "Someone is feeding them our weak points as fast as we generate them." The confirmation came 4 minutes later, and it landed harder than the enemy's shells had. A junior comms officer, cross-checking outbound traffic logs on a hunch, found the leak, a low-power transmission buried under the noise of a dozen legitimate diagnostic pings, broadcasting live shield integrity data on a frequency no compact vessel had any business using. Internal, deliberate, ongoing. The bridge went very quiet in the particular way. A room goes quiet when a crew realizes the enemy outside is not the only one trying to kill them. Locating the source took longer than anyone aboard would have liked. The Ashen Cradle's internal network spanned 11 decks and thousands of relay points, and a signal deliberately buried under diagnostic noise could, in theory, be broadcasting from almost anywhere. Vashtar security teams began a deck-by-deck sweep using standard signal triangulation gear, methodical and thorough, and by Milo's estimate when he finally heard the plan relayed to him, hopelessly slow. "You're triangulating off the ship's main sensor array," he said, propped against a bulkhead in the corridor outside medical, still catching his breath from the climb up from Deck 9. "That array runs through the same trunk lines I spent this whole day getting intimately familiar with. There's dead zones in that coverage, spots the leak could hide in that your triangulation gear literally cannot see. Because I know for a fact half the repeater nodes in that trunk haven't reported a clean status ping since before I got assigned to this ship." "You are certain of this?" Sierra said. "I'm certain the notes on my tablet cross-reference the maintenance log's dead repeater list against the deck schematic. Yeah. 3 candidate junctions, all of them isolated, all of them unmonitored since the fire scattered damage control. Somebody who knew this ship's blind spots picked one of those on purpose." He managed a thin, exhausted smile. "Turns out being the guy nobody watches teaches you exactly where nobody else is watching either." It took security teams 4 more minutes to converge on the second of Milo's 3 candidate junctions and confirm, from the sound of a startled logistics officer scrambling to shut down an open panel, that his instinct had been right. Castavan's engineering teams caught the signal's origin point fast enough, a maintenance relay 2 decks below the bridge, conveniently isolated, conveniently unmonitored since the fires had scattered damage control crews across the ship. What they couldn't do fast enough was cut it off without also severing the ship's own primary sensor feed, which ran through the exact same trunk line by a design decision made, ironically, for redundancy reasons that had never anticipated sabotage from within. "We sever that relay, we go blind for the rest of this fight," Castavan's second reported. "We don't sever it, they know our every move before we make it." It was, once again, Sierra, propped against a bridge console, her legs still braced, refusing medical leave with the stubbornness of someone who had recently learned a few things about stubbornness from an unlikely teacher, who suggested they ask the human what he thought, because the human had, twice now, found a third option where the ship's own engineers had found only 2 bad ones. Milo, arms still wrapped, shoulders still tender, walked onto the bridge of a Vashtar warship for the first time in his life to a silence that wasn't contempt anymore. It was something closer to expectation. "Show me the relay schematic," he said, "and somebody get me the maintenance override codes, because I am not doing this the hard way twice in one day." A fleet that expected an easier kill. Aboard the lead Korathi raider, Commander HFY watched the Ashen Cradle's shields refuse to fail with the particular irritation of a predator who had planned every variable except the one that mattered. His fleet had spent 3 months preparing this ambush, cultivating DOS's cooperation through a network of intermediaries, mapping the Ashen Cradle's patrol schedule down to the hour, timing the boarding action to strip exactly the coolant redundancy his intelligence reports said would leave the ship crippled. Every piece had clicked into place exactly as designed. And still the compact vessel's shields held, dipped, and steadied, refusing to give him the clean kill his months of planning had promised. Their coolant network should be at 40% capacity at most, his own tactical officer reported, baffled. "Something has restored partial function we did not account for." Vor had not risen to command a raiding fleet by ignoring inconvenient data. "Then find out what," he said, "and target our next volley at whatever compensation they have found before they find a way to sustain it." He would not get the chance. By the time his gunners retargeted the traitor's feed, the one advantage that had let his fleet walk its fire onto the Ashen Cradle's weakest point with surgical precision, had already gone dark, cut by a small, unremarkable human crouched behind a startled logistics officer 2 decks below. the compact ship's bridge. Vor would spend the rest of the engagement firing blind at a target that no longer told him where to aim, and by the time he recognized the fight had turned against him, it was already too late to recover the advantage his 3 months of planning had bought, and then lost in the span of 11 minutes. The climax, solved by a wrench and not a fist. The schematic told him what he needed in under a minute. The sabotaged relay wasn't a single point of failure, it was a shared junction. Sensor data and the traders leak riding the same physical cable for exactly 4 meters before splitting off into separate conduits. Sever the cable anywhere along its full length, and yes, they'd lose both signals together. But 4 meters was enough room to work with, if you knew exactly where the split happened, and Milo, bored, thorough, endlessly curious Milo, who'd spent 6 months tracing pipe and cable runs on this ship, because there was nothing else to do on a night shift, knew exactly where. The split's inside an access panel on Deck 7, he said. If I get there, I can physically separate the 2 lines before they diverge instead of after. Cut the trader's feed clean, leave your sensors running. That access panel is inside the compromised relay room, Castavan's second said. DOS will see anyone approaching on the room's internal monitor. Then I don't approach through the door. Milo was already moving toward the schematic display, tracing a route with one finger. There's a ventilation shaft that runs behind that wall, same one I used to reach the coolant junction earlier today. I go in through the vent. I'm behind him before he knows anyone's coming. And if he is armed? Sierra asked, already knowing the answer, already bracing for it. Then it's a good thing I'm small, Milo said, with the flat, exhausted humor of a man who had stopped being afraid of the obvious hours ago. Ventilation shafts weren't built for people your size. For once, that's an advantage. The vent shaft leading to Deck 7 was narrower than the one he'd used earlier, barely wide enough to let him drag himself forward on elbows and knees, his burned arm shrieking every time it took weight, his breath coming in short, controlled sips, because anything deeper set off a coughing fit that would carry straight through the thin metal walls. Twice he had to stop entirely, forehead pressed against cold duct plating, waiting for a wave of dizziness to pass before it dragged him under completely. Somewhere behind him, relayed through a calm bead tucked in his ear, he could hear Sierra's voice, low and steady, counting down the seconds the bridge crew could still afford to give him. 90 seconds until the next targeting update transmits, she said. Milo, are you still moving? Moving, he managed, though it came out more breath than word, just taking the scenic route. It took him 6 minutes to crawl the length of the shaft, injured arms screaming with every pull, smoke-scarred lungs fighting him the whole way. And when he finally reached the vent grate overlooking the relay room, he could see Varen Das clearly through the slats below. A Vashtar logistics officer, younger than Castavan, his uniform still crisp despite the chaos elsewhere on the ship, hunched over an open panel with the calm, methodical efficiency of a man executing a plan he'd rehearsed many times in his head. There was no panic in the way he worked, no hesitation. Just the quiet, practiced motions of someone who had convinced himself, over months of mounting debt and passed-over promotions, that this betrayal was simply the price of a future he deserved and hadn't been given. Milo watched him for 3 full seconds through the great slats and felt something colder than the fire had left in him. Not hatred exactly, just a plain, unglamorous contempt for a man who'd sold 600 lives for a number in a ledger. Then he pried the grate loose and dropped down behind him, and Milo didn't fight him. He didn't have the strength left to fight a creature twice his mass, and he'd learned exactly one lesson clearly enough by now to bet his life on it. Humans in this galaxy did not win by being stronger. He hit the emergency decompression seal on the relay room's secondary hatch instead, a seal designed to isolate a compartment during hull breaches, which slammed shut between Das and his own escape route, the instant Milo's fist came down on the control. And while Das spun, startled, toward the sound, Milo was already at the open panel, two wires pinched between fingers that shook from exhaustion and burn damaged both, cutting the trader's feet a half-second before Das could react. The enemy fleet's targeting data went dark. The Ashen Cradle's own sensors stayed lit. Das lunged. Milo, unable to outrun or outfight a Vashtar built for high-gravity combat, did the only thing left. He threw himself sideways into the open relay panel's expose. Ed capacitor bank, triggering a safety discharge that dropped every light in the compartment and sent 400 volts of harmless to Vashtar but briefly incapacitating current through the metal decking Das was standing on. It wasn't a weapon, and Milo would say so later to anyone who asked, with the same flat insistence he used for everything else that day. It was a fuse box doing exactly what fuse boxes were engineered to do: bleed off a dangerous overcharge into the nearest grounded surface, rather than let it build towards something that could cook the whole relay junction. The capacitor bank existed to protect equipment from exactly the kind of surge Das's sabotage had been risking for the last hour. Milo had simply pointed that protection at a person instead of a panel, close enough to the discharge point that Das's own boots, planted flat on the same decking, completed the circuit for him. It dropped the Vashtar officer to one knee, jaw locked, every muscle in his leg seizing at once, and it bought precisely enough time for two Vashtar security officers, alerted by Sira the moment Milo dropped into that vent, to breach the sealed hatch and take Das down without a shot fired. That, Sira said afterward, reviewing the relay room's internal recording with an expression somewhere between disbelief and something that might, in time, become fondness, was not covered in any tactics manual I have studied. Wasn't tactics, Milo said, still catching his breath against the relay housing. Wiring, there's a difference. One of them they don't teach you at officer school, apparently. Resolution, in a voice that wanted food. The fight didn't end there, not cleanly. 6 ships don't disengage because one trader's feed goes dark. But it turned. Without live targeting data, Vor's gunners were forced back onto standard sensor sweeps, their fire spreading out across the Ashen Cradle's shield envelope instead of concentrating on its one true weakness, and every volley that landed now cost the compact ship a fraction of what it would have cost minutes earlier. Castavan pressed the advantage the moment he recognized it, ordering a full return volley concentrated on the lead raider's engine section, and the fight that had looked, 10 minutes earlier, like a foregone conclusion began instead to look like exactly the kind of grinding, costly, evenly matched engagement neither side wanted to finish. With their targeting advantage gone and the Ashen Cradle's shields holding steady, the enemy commander made the calculation every competent tactician eventually makes when the numbers stop favoring a fight. He ran. The remaining battle was mop-up, the kind that gets summarized in an after-action report rather than lived through breath by breath. And by the time the last enemy contact dropped off sensors 2 hours later, the Ashen Cradle was still, against every reasonable expectation 4 hours earlier, in one piece. Milo Reyes slept through most of it, unconscious on a medical gurney with his arm in regeneration foam, a Vashtar commander's sidearm resting on the tray beside him like a strange, heavy souvenir he hadn't asked for and didn't yet understand. The medical bay itself had changed around him while he slept, in small ways he only half-registered coming out of the haze of sedation. A steady rotation of crew, engineers he'd never spoken 2 words to, security officers who'd walked past him 100 times without a nod, had taken turns standing quiet watch outside the door, not because anyone had ordered them to, but because word travels fast on a ship that nearly died, and gratitude, once it finds somewhere to go, tends to show up in person. When he woke, Sira was there sitting, not standing, her leg finally in a proper brace, looking at him with an expression that on a human face might have been called tenderness, though she would never have used that word herself. "You are awake," she said. "Good. There are 17 crew members waiting outside this room to speak with you, including the commander. He has informed me he intends to formally commend your service and, I believe, apologize for the wording of a requisition memo." Milo blinked at the ceiling for a long moment, taking inventory of a body that hurt in more places than he had names for. 17 people, he said, and none of them thought to bring food. Sierra's mouth did something that, on a human, would have been a smile trying very hard to stay professional. "I could arrange it." "Arrange it," Milo said, closing his eyes again. "And somebody better be logging hazard pay for today, because I am filing every single hour of this against my contract the second I can hold a stylus. Degree burns, a shoulder that's popped out twice, smoke that tasted like a bad decision. That's not menial technical labor. That's a whole different pay grade." "I will personally ensure the paperwork reflects it," Sierra said, and there was something almost like warmth buried under the formal cadence now, something that hadn't been there in the corridor full of smoke 6 hours earlier. "For what it is worth, Milo Reyes, I do not believe anyone aboard this ship will describe you as unremarkable again." "Good," Milo mumbled, already half back asleep. "Unremarkable doesn't get you a commander's sidearm and a decent lunch. I'll take the upgrade." Outside the medical bay, word was already spreading through the Ashen Cradle, the way it always does on a ship that's just survived something it shouldn't have, not as an official report, but as the kind of story crew tells each other in mess halls and maintenance corridors for years afterward. The one about the fire nobody was supposed to walk into. The one about the small, soft, unremarkable human who did it anyway twice, and then a third time for good measure, and asked for nothing in return except, eventually, lunch. By the time Milo was cleared to leave medical 2 days later, arm still tender under fresh-grown skin, shoulder wrapped in a brace he complained about constantly and refused to remove early, something on the Ashen Cradle had quietly and permanently shifted. Crewmen who had walked past him in corridors for 8 months without a nod now made a point of clearing a path when they saw him coming, tools still slung on his wrist roll, headlamp still clipped crooked out of habit. Junior engineers started showing up at his usual maintenance bay with questions they'd have been embarrassed to ask a week earlier, not out of pity, but because word had gotten around that the human who fixed the temperamental gravity plating on Deck 6 was the same one who'd rerouted a coolant system by hand while half his own arm was cooking. Varen Das was taken to the brig within the hour, and the formal inquiry that followed in the weeks after would strip him of rank, service record, and under compact law for wartime treason, considerably more than that. Nobody aboard the Ashen Cradle mourned the outcome. What lingered longer than any satisfaction at justice served was the quieter, more uncomfortable lesson the whole crew carried away from it: that the greatest danger to the ship hadn't come from 6 raider vessels or a ruptured plasma line, but from someone they'd trusted enough never to watch closely. The same blind spot, Milo pointed out once, dry and half-joking, that had let him walk past unnoticed for 8 months doing nothing worse than fixing pipes. "Funny how that works," he said to Sierra, the two of them going over the final incident report together in the quiet of his maintenance bay. "Nobody watches the guy they've already decided doesn't matter. Cuts both ways, turns out. Almost got us all killed. Also happened to save us." "I will not make that mistake again," Sierra said, and there was no formality left in it at all. Castavan made good on his commendation, formally and in front of the assembled crew, though Milo spent most of the ceremony shifting his weight and looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. When the commander finally asked, in front of everyone, whether there was anything Milo wanted as recognition beyond the sidearm already sitting in his bunk, Milo thought about it for a long moment. "A real chair for the maintenance bay," he said finally. "The one I've got's been broken since before I got here, and maybe somebody could fix the vending unit on Deck 6. It's eaten 4 of my ration chits and given me nothing back." The bridge crew laughed a real laugh, not a polite one, And Castavan, who had not laughed at much of anything in longer than he cared to admit, found himself doing it too. Sierra stood near the back of the gathered crew, weight still favoring her good leg, watching the small, unremarkable human who had carried her out of a fire. Nobody was supposed to survive get handed a working chair and a promise about a vending machine, as though it were the only reward that mattered to him. In a strange way, she understood by then. It was. That, she thought, was perhaps the truest thing anyone had told her about humans since she'd met one. Not the speeches, not the schematics, not even the courage. Just a person who did the impossible thing and then asked, immediately afterward when lunch was. Weeks later, once the Ashen Cradle had limped its way to a repair yard, and the official inquiry into Verendas's betrayal had closed its final report, Sierra found Milo in his usual maintenance bay, sitting in the new chair Castavan had made good on, tinkering with a stubborn atmospheric regulator that had never quite worked right since the fire. Her leg had healed clean, the brace long since removed, though she still favored it faintly on cold mornings, a permanent souvenir of the day the deck had nearly killed them both. "The commander has offered you a formal commission," she said without preamble, the way she said most things. "Engineering rank, full crew status, full quarters, full pay scale, not racked labor. He asked me to inform you, since he suspected you would negotiate the terms more honestly with someone who has already seen you at your worst." Milo didn't look up from the regulator right away. "Full pay scale," he repeated. "Does that come with hazard pay built in, or do I gotta fight for that every single time something catches fire?" "I would recommend fighting for it regardless," Sierra said. A younger Vashtar engineer, one of the crew who'd spent the last 8 months walking past Milo without a second glance, had lingered near the maintenance bay entrance during the conversation, curiosity finally outweighing habit. He stepped forward now, hesitant in a way that didn't suit his size. "May I ask you something?" he said to Milo. "Before, when the deck sealed and the order came to abandon it, you were not required to go. Your contract did not obligate you to risk your life for an officer you had never spoken to. I do not understand why you did." Milo set down the tool he'd been holding and thought about it honestly, because it seemed like the question deserved that much. "Because nobody else was going to," he said finally. "And because I've spent my whole life being the guy people don't expect much from. Figured just once I'd find out what I was actually capable of instead of what everybody assumed. Turns out the answer was more than they thought. Doesn't mean I'm not still sore about it, mind you. Just means I'd do it again." The young engineer considered that for a long moment, then nodded once, the way Vashtar did when a thing had been properly understood, and left without further comment. Sierra watched him go, then turned back to Milo with something unreadable in her flat gray eyes. "You seem skilled at that particular negotiation." He laughed, a real one, tired and a little rough around the edges, the kind of laugh that belonged to a man who'd spent 8 months being furniture and had, in the space of one very bad day, become something else entirely. "Tell the commander I'll take it, on one condition." "Which is?" "You're on my crew roster for the next fire. Figure we're better as a matched set at this point." He held up his forearm, the skin there still faintly pale and new where the burn had regrown, a scar that would never fully fade. "Besides, somebody's gotta keep telling me what I can't do, gives me something to prove wrong." Sierra considered that for a long moment, in the flat, careful way she considered most things, and then inclined her head, not the full formal bow of a debt owed, just a small, private acknowledgement between two people who had already been through the worst, a ship could throw at them and come out the other side still standing. "Agreed," she said. "Though I would ask that next time you allow me to walk on my own legs into the fire, rather than being dragged out of it." "No promises," Milo said, and went back to the regulator, and somewhere down the corridor, for the first time in 8 months, somebody said his name to a passing crewman without having to be reminded what it was. If this is the kind of story that gets your blood up, hit like and subscribe so more of them find their way to you. And drop a comment telling me what you'd have grabbed off that supply rack before walking into the fire yourself. Share it with someone who still doesn't believe the small guy can carry the whole ship out on his back.